You're listening to the Missionary Perspective Podcast with veteran missionaries Erik Johnson and Joshua Mead. We're glad you could join us. We trust this podcast will be both a blessing and a challenge as we relate topics in world evangelism from a missionary perspective. Now, here's Josh and Erik.
Welcome to the Missionary Perspective Podcast. I am your host, Erik Johnson, and it's been a while, but I'm so glad to be reunited with my good friend, Josh Mead in Senegal, West Africa. Josh, how are you doing today?
I am doing great. I'm back with my daughter's pink headphones because they broke
Yes, looks very
they broke
nice.
the other pair I had. So hey, I'm just sporting it. I think it looks good. I'm wearing a shirt here that was sent to me from a
Hmm.
Senegalese gentleman in Italy. Sent it to me when I was in the States because he wanted me to model the shirt and promote it for him on my social
Wow.
media sites. And so it's always nice to get free gear from friends from different parts of the
Yeah.
world. Yeah, so we're doing well. We are
Maybe
finally.
it's time we do some Missionary Perspective Podcast merch, Josh. What do you think?
I like it. I like it. That sounds awesome.
Oh boy. Well, it's always good to catch up with friends and Josh and I, we would love to have the podcast be more consistent, but honestly, with missionary life, you just never know what's going on. And that is kind of how we're going to start today. We've been going through a situation in our church recently. We've been here almost 16 years. Josh has been basically the same time in Senegal. And I know there's a topic that's not a lot of fun to talk about, Josh, but one that I think for especially for future missionaries, one that veteran missionaries should try to explain a little bit is about how to handle death on the mission field. It's not something you can plan for, but yet it's something that is ever present and often never usually expected. And I just think it'll be really unique for us to kind of go through the different experiences we've had. As I mentioned recently, we've gone through it here in our church. It was the first time we had someone in our church who was very, very important in our church, a kind of a pillar in the church. We've had a number of people pass away who went to the church off and on, or maybe a family member of a church member. So we'll talk about that and the different experience we had. But it's just something we're coming out of now, and it's very much on our mind as a family, a church family, and our family. And I thought, this is something we've never really talked a lot about. Josh has had a few stories, but I thought maybe in general we could talk about something that I don't think people like to talk about, Josh.
Yeah, I think it's an important topic on two fronts. Number one, whether you're a missionary or a pastor, your first funeral you'll conduct can be intimidating. I know my first
Absolutely.
funeral that I conducted, I was only a year out of Bible college, and it was a man that my great grandmother had lived with for years. Um, Not sure if he was a professing believer. I think he might have made a deathbed profession. And the first thing I noticed about conducting his funeral was every all eyes are on you, expecting you to know what to do. And
Mm.
as a young man just out of Bible college, and he was a veteran, so there were a lot of older veterans there that they're used to order and all of that. And yeah, you had to act like you knew what you were doing when it was the first time I'd ever done it, and tried to do the best I could. So that's one. You need to make sure you know how to properly approach conduct, and how to properly lead and conduct the funeral. But secondly, I
Mhm.
would say cross-culturally, when you're on the mission field, there are a few key events that can help you gain insight into the worldview of the people that you are seeking to minister to. And funerals
Yes.
and death is one of those times in which the reality of people's worldviews really comes to the forefront. And I'll share some of that later with the kind of the dynamic of work, conducting funerals and attending funerals in a primarily Islamic nation, as opposed to maybe a funeral. I remember the first funeral I went to in the States. It was a coworker who had a brother who died, and they didn't know the Lord, and the despair at the oh, I forget the word, enterrement, the burial. The
Hmm.
despair was I just never seen just hopelessness before like that expressed so aggressively and emotionally, and it really made an impact on me. But then I'll share a little bit more about kind of my observations at funerals I've attended of Muslims. And then, of course, I've conducted a couple funerals here of nobody in our church directly linked. There's a gentleman I conducted his funeral who had been recently saved, but had not become an official member yet before passing away. But you just recently conducted a funeral, am I right? Of a member in your church.
Yeah, it was one of those things where sometimes the Lord will give you insight about something before it's coming. And we had gotten word that one of our church members, in fact, it's really neat. This lady, um, next to Holly and I think has invited and brought more people to church than anyone in our 16 years almost here. And just a real, heartbeat in the church. Anyway, she was just a very gregarious, fun, just wonderful spirit of the church. And very quickly, she fell ill. They found out it was cancer, and literally within a month, she was gone. And I think it had a lot to do with not having proper prevention and some healthcare situations there. But really, we kind of saw that this was probably going to happen. And actually, when Pastor Harry was here, I was getting some advice from him because just I kind of knew this was probably going to happen. But yet, when she actually passed, I'm thankful the Lord didn't have her suffer long. We got amazing opportunities to preach the gospel. She was a very well-known person, not only in our church, but really in town through some of the different endeavors she had had, and just a really transformative life as well. But what I kind of want to talk to today is just maybe talk about what death is like on a third world country or a mission field. Because truth be told, I don't know how it is. I will say in America, even different parts of the country handle death differently. I grew up in a culture in the North that, if you didn't have a family member or a close member pass away, you didn't really go to the funeral home very often. I don't remember going probably half a dozen times in my life. There were a couple young people who passed away who were friends of mine when I was a teenager, and then some family members, but really hadn't spent a lot of time in funeral homes. Whereas in the South, it's different. It's just a different culture. And so I understand even in America it's different, but here in the Dominican Republic, and I want Josh to speak to his experiences there, primarily because of the lack of embalmment they have here. When someone passes, you have usually less than 24 hours before they're placed in either a mausoleum or buried or whatever they do. And so if you live in the States, you probably will not make it in time. Every service and every family is different, but normally, if they are not people of means, they will, after the person passes, they will put them in their casket. They will rent a big bucket, if you will, that goes underneath the casket where they put basically hunks of ice so that the body will not, stink for the the 24 hours. There's a couple other things they'll do. And basically, people come by for the next, 12 to 20 hours and give their respects to the family. Oftentimes, when it's a poorer family, just happens to be this way. Obviously, circumstances of the person's death are important, but even someone who is old, you'll have a lot of wailing, a lot of crying. And then when you get more of the wealthier, middle class, wealthier people, they oftentimes can afford to rent a funeral home where they do very much the similar thing. Might be a little more higher class, but within that 24 hours, they are going to be putting that person to rest. And as a pastor, you have to be ready. You have to be ready at any moment to not only go minister to the family, but to have a message ready. And we'll talk a little bit later maybe how they do their messages. But that's kind of the quickness. I mean, death in itself is abrupt, but there's something about we had someone in the States in our home church who passed away recently. And I think they waited 10 days before they had, excuse me, his memorial service. Here, it's not that way. And so death just so quick and it's all taken care of very quickly. How is it there in Senegal, Josh?
Very similar. Obviously, there's religious reasons why they put people on the ground very quickly. In Islam, you're supposed to, within 24 hours, you have to get them in the ground. And I think a lot of that is rooted back to just the lack of embalmment and things like that. But there is a lot that surrounds things that take place during the funeral, similar to what you're describing. I do remember you mentioned, in the States, kind of different cultures have different
Hmm.
ways that they handle death. And I feel like, and it's different in every individual context, but I feel like maybe in the North, where I'm from, Northwest, Midwest, there's a little more of just formality to funerals. You do the funeral, pay your respects, and then you just kind of move on. I mean, obviously, as an individual, if you lose a close loved one, it's different. But I noticed a stark difference the first time I traveled to Kentucky with my grandma. Went down there to preach in a church,
Mm,
the church where the area where my grandma grew up. And there's a
mhm,
unique fascination with death and events that
mhm,
surround death. And we went to all these different gravesites. And I mean, we've went up in
mhm,
this hill in the back of the mountains where we found these grave sites that were like from the 1800s. And then my
mhm.
grandma would share stories about the way people passed away. And that was kind of how their memory was kept. And they kind of memorialize, and there's a big deal that surrounds it, way bigger
Mhm.
deal than I think sometimes we make of it in the north. So then
Yeah.
coming to Senegal, a lot of what you've described is similar. Um, there is one country here in West Africa where I don't want to get it wrong. It might be Cameroon, but I'm not sure. But they'll embalm the body, and then they'll place you the body of the deceased. They'll put you in a pose of whatever hobby you enjoyed. So I had a
Hmm.
friend who's from there whose dad enjoyed driving, and they propped him up in a car, and everybody came by and paid the respects. To me, it's weird. It's
Mhm.
like, whoa,
That's
I
very,
don't,
very interesting.
I don't know. It's been like they've had him, propped up in a garden, and it's just, I don't know. That's out there for me, and I don't know. I don't know how I would handle that. But that being said, here, uh, the Muslim funerals I've attended, it's actually a very quick process for Muslims specifically. You go straight to you go straight where he's going to be buried. So when somebody passes away, and this is in the Islamic context, when somebody passes away, you'll go and pay respects, usually before he's buried or right after. And then if it's a man, his wife will be the one responsible to wrap the body. There's a very specific cloth that they wrap the
Mhm.
body in, and the wife is responsible for doing that, and she can ask others to help her. But there's really nobody that comes in to help you like a funeral home, like you were saying. You're responsible to make sure he's wrapped and all that taken care of. And usually it's just, a makeshift box that they'll put you in. And then it's just the men that will generally go to the gravesite. They'll have a burial there. The imam or a marabu will give a, Quranic recitation. They'll do a prayer. And there's a final prayer. I forgot what it was in Arabic. I was just studying it the other day. But there's a final prayer that they'll make when they lay you down into the ground. Now, one of the things I found interesting, again, with Islamic funerals, is that they believe that there are angels recording everything you're doing. And they also
Mm,
record the testimony that others give of your life to present every evidence to Allah that they can to plead your case that you are a good guy and you're worthy to get into heaven.
mm,
And at the day of your funeral, these angels come down and they listen to what people are saying about the deceased and they record it. And so Malik, our pastor, was telling me they'll make up stories. They'll just say how wonderful, no matter how bad of a person you might have been, how poorly you treated people, they'll say what a great guy you were because maybe once it's on the written record, it's official, I guess. So it's it's things
wow.
like that. And then one I've noticed with families dealing with loved ones who have died, I think it's part of the fatalism that goes along with Islam. There's this idea,
Hmm.
inshallah, it's the will of God, whatever's going to be is will be. And so I can't show as much emotion toward tragedy because if Allah willed it, which it which God does will all things that come to pass in our life, but he also created us humans with emotions that are to mourn and to grieve and to express those things. And so I've noticed a lot of times, for example, I had a neighbor whose son was hit by a bus and killed. And
Mm,
when I was speaking to them and offering my condolences and all that, they just said, God willed it and it is what it is. And I thought,
mm,
it's it's a mask. There's hurt
mm,
on the inside that
mm,
this mother feels she has to mask. And so for me, I saw that on many occasions,
mm,
especially where a mother would try to hide and conceal the grief of losing a
mm,
child. And so to me, it was very telling that this is a religion that really tries to put a mask on the reality of human need, and it doesn't address true human need. And so when you understand that, you can approach how you share the gospel in a more sensitive light. But yeah, we've had a couple funerals I've conducted for Christians. There was a pastor in town whose daughter died of cancer. This was years ago.
Mm.
And I had never met her and had just met the pastor. And so I don't know if he just wanted a white guy to do the funeral or a white pastor. I don't know. I said, yeah, I'd be honored to. And so I have a few messages that I have prepared to
Hmm.
present, especially if I think you'll have a different message prepared if it's somebody you don't know or somebody not connected to your
Hmm.
church. There's kind of generic, especially if you don't know if they're believers or not. Obviously, you got to have
Sure.
every situation you got to be prepared for. But I think, and that's normal even if you're conducting funerals in the States. But Eric, if you're conducting a funeral for somebody you don't really know that well, or maybe somebody you don't know
Hmm.
if it's a Christian and they have
Hmm.
unsaved family members there,
Hmm.
there are cultural considerations you have to take into
Hmm.
factor in your message,
Yeah.
even. Would you agree?
Absolutely. In fact, um, at this point in time, I kind of have a baseline sermon that I start with, which is real generic, and then I kind of flesh it out depending on who the person is. Like you said, is someone you know. I've been often asked to preach the funerals of people who are in my church who their family members, moms and dads, have passed away, or someone who maybe visited the church a time or two, and maybe we're pretty sure they probably weren't believers. And so, a friend of mine actually preached this message years ago, and the basic premise is if this person, whoever the person is that's deceased, were here today, because they've obviously gone on to the next life, they'd want you to know this. And so you can come from that context of being a believer or a non-believer. You don't really have to focus, oftentimes if it's a person I don't know or I feel pretty confident that person is not has not we're not saved, I won't spend a lot of time talking about that person if I'm given the opportunity to preach the gospel. I'll say, we feel very sad because we've lost a part of our community. There have been people who lost a family member. But if this person were here today, they want you to know this. And I don't know how the context is. And let me just tell you, every funeral I've been to is different. There isn't this dichotomy between when you're at an actual funeral home and you're at like literally someone's home. Um, but I will say this, and this is maybe I don't. It sounds like it's the case there in Senegal as well. In America, we have a concept of a funeral being in a church or some big place where you're sitting down, where we actually would call that more of a memorial service. I've only done that twice here. Been fortunate enough to do that twice. Most of the time, you are literally next to the casket. People are coming in and out. In the Dominican, people are literally coming in on their motorcycles, walking in, hearing crying people. Like they basically put their hands on the people, tell them how sorry they are, and they stick around for 5 or 10 minutes, and then they're gone. And it's just this movement of people. And you're just so sensitive to understand that they're not used to it. You're going to stand up and speak next to a body. They're not used to that. The Catholic Church does have their last mass, they might call it. I don't go into that. I don't understand all that, obviously, but they don't do that next to the body. The body's usually in another place. And so, and all the times I've been able to go into places and preach the gospel, whether it be in a funeral home or next to the body itself, I really just try to get to the heart of the issue of the gospel. I try to have it wrapped up in less than 15 minutes. And I can tell you, those are some of the more difficult times because I'm a preacher that like I don't like a lot of distractions, and there is no more distractions than you can possibly imagine than at a funeral home with people moving around, talking, wailing. And so you just have to ask for the Lord's guidance and, try to keep just, you got that shot to give the opportunity. How were your experiences?
Yeah, I would say with the influence of Islam and then the influence of Roman Catholicism, which is much less than Islam, but they share similar concepts when it comes to death. And I think it's more rooted in traditions and animistic
Hmm.
background, where I guess the best way to put it is this. A lot of times in the States, a funeral, we're more focused on if you're a Christian, were they saved or not? And the pastor is going to bring
Hmm.
that up. And I think if
Hmm.
you know they weren't saved or you're unsure, you make a great point. That's a great way to address what would they want you to know now. And so the audience is thinking, okay, if they were believers, well, we are rejoicing, they're in heaven,
Hmm.
they're with the Lord, and so we can rejoice with that they're with the Lord, things like that. Whereas in our culture, even Christians have this concept that we're not here to figure out where he is. We're here because this is
Hmm.
a key moment to get him into heaven. Like, so he can, if you're Catholic, he's got to skip
Hmm.
purgatory. Like, how can we, what do we have to do right
Hmm.
now to make sure? Because this is real. This is where, this is it
Yeah.
now. Like, he's
Yeah.
passed over, and we've got
Yeah.
to do all these rituals and prayers and all
Hmm.
of this to make sure he gets over on the other side.
Candles.
Yeah,
Hmm.
and so there's all these superstitions that surround it and the baggage that comes with that from the former superstitions of animism. And then Islam continues to perpetuate some of that. Roman Catholicism has incorporated some of it with their doctrine of purgatory, things like that. That as a pastor, if I know that this person is saved, then what I will do is, especially if there's unsaved uh, people in attendance. And you're right, most of the time, I'm trying to think. I've never preached a funeral here or even attended a funeral inside a church, except for a Catholic funeral I went to, and the body was in the church, but it was in a different location, like you said, and then they did their mass and
Hmm.
things like that. But so that being said, though, yeah, it's this idea that the funeral is all about helping them get carried over into the other side and make sure that everything's done properly. So the message I try to emphasize is here is what this person confessed in this life. And then let's go to scriptures and see what scripture says of someone who holds this confession. And then we can look at the scriptures where it's clear you're accepted in the beloved. You're in the family of God. You're born again, not of the will of the
Hmm.
flesh. I love John chapter 1 because it really, whether you're Catholic or
Hmm.
Muslim, it is 100% clear. Nobody can do anything on your behalf to get you into heaven and in God's presence. You have to be born again, born of God, and that is by receiving Jesus Christ. And the Bible's very clear on that. And
Hmm.
so, um, yeah, that's I took that approach when a gentleman who had gotten saved, but then ended up attempting suicide, and
I remember that.
he did succumb to his injuries, and ended up dying. But he did repent. Now I believe he was
Mm.
born again, and the attempted suicide, even if he wasn't coherent enough to repent after he had, did what he did to harm himself,
Hmm.
um, he was still saved. Whereas the Catholic Church and the Muslim Church, at least here, I can't speak for the whole religion, but here, you commit suicide, you don't go to heaven. It's done.
Yeah.
Sorry, you're
Yeah.
out.
Yeah.
And so to be able to, he was coherent enough to express repentance. And so I was able to take that. And then I just pointed out because there was a lot of concern by his Catholic family, and then he had Muslim family.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
I pointed to his confession, and then I pointed to the clear teaching of Scripture. And that's where the Catholic priest got up after me, and I just told the Lord, I think I shared this story before, but I said, Lord, don't let this Catholic priest undo, like talk about purgatory and the fact that he commits, all this. Like, just don't let him undo the gospel that was just planted. And the priest stood up and said, well, I don't really have anything else to add beyond what Pastor Dowda just said. So let's move on to the next, next portion. And so,
Yeah.
yeah, so I would say, yeah, there's a lot of similarities to what you're mentioning and things you have to take into consideration that are contextualized to the people you're reaching.
I like to use the passage generally from John 11, where Jesus himself is at Lazarus' funeral. And for me, the key verse I try to start from or kind of have as the heart of the message is where Jesus is speaking to Martha and he says, I'm the resurrection and the life. He that believeth in me, though he were dead, yet shall he live. And whosoever liveth and believeth in me shall never die. And then he ends with the question, believest thou this? And I really try to get to that question. Say honestly, everything else that we're doing in these contexts change. Whether it be Catholic or a person's atheist or Christian in name or Christian for real. All that doesn't really matter if you've been given the opportunity. And this is kind of what I wanted to kind of finish up the podcast on,
Mhm.
is talk about maybe experiences or opportunities we've had or how we've seen it in a positive way. Because really, I remember the first. I think I guess it probably was the first one I ever had. Some missionary who was 30 minutes from me was on furlough. A fellow BI, my missionary, called me and said, and to this day I can't remember if the person was in the church or not, and they must have been someone connected with their church. Said, "Can you go and just preach the gospel at this funeral?" I'm out of the country, XYZ. The guys from my church will show you where it's at. I'm like, all right, I'm a young missionary. I don't know any better. I got something to say. I'm just going to give the gospel, and I don't know this person. And I mean, first of all, my Spanish a year in is not probably the greatest. I know that. And I have never in my life been to a Dominican funeral. And so I can't even imagine how goofy it was for these poor people who are their loved one has passed away. And I do believe this person actually was a believer. And this gringo to walk in, they don't know, he can barely speak Spanish, and he starts talking about God. And from that point on, I was like, I got to be better prepared than this because this is nonsense. I don't even know what's going on here. But from that point on, I basically tried to keep it simplistic and understand that when it comes to consoling family, they just want you there. We've gone through some crazy stuff. People in our church who have had tragedies. I have a young man in our church a couple years ago. He literally walked out of the room and his sister was shot and murdered by an ex-husband, and then he killed himself. And I mean, what do you do in that stage? There's nothing you
Yeah.
can do other than hug this kid, give
Yeah.
him, give him, comfort, and be with him, and then preach the gospel when he gives the opportunity. But I can say we've seen amazing things happen as well. I'm thinking specifically of a neighbor who the wife and the children had gone to church from the very beginning at our church, but the husband would only come on occasional times, and he wasn't saved. But when his mother-in-law was dying, and we were with the wife and her family when that was going on, and when the mother-in-law passed, I got the opportunity to preach. I'm pretty sure she was saved. But this neighbor of mine, watching us love on his family and be there for them, I know made a big impact in his life because a few months later he got saved and he's been in our church ever since. And so we've seen a number of times where I still learn so many cultural things, but I realize you just got to go to the weddings, funerals, and the births as much as you can. It doesn't have to be like you have a lot of things to say, but just the presence there means a lot and really can make an impact in your messages down the road.
Yeah, it's really important. Your whole missionary career, those are the key moments of relationship building. But you're never going to get away from that. But I would say if you're a young missionary going in, that's how you solidify relationships with people in your community. Be there for their funerals, be there for their weddings, and especially funerals. A lot of it is in our culture. It's you just sit around all day. You'll sit there for hours
Hmm.
and just sit
Hmm.
there, and you might not even talk to anybody. Your presence, though, it's going to be remembered forever by the community that you were there, you were present. And so it is an essential part of the integration process into into the mission field. You can gain insight into the culture as well. There's just so much that goes into this aspect of ministry. Yes, it does allow opportunities to share the gospel, and that's what you should seek to use it for. But just like any other context as a missionary, make sure in those occasions you're being sensitive to the culture, right? Like sometimes
Hmm.
when talking about death, we are not direct at all when talking about death here. You just, oh, what did he die of? You don't do that. So you do need to make sure you connect with a veteran missionary, get
Hmm.
some tips and insight into, hey, what's the
Hmm.
proper
Hmm.
etiquette if I'm attending a funeral? Certainly, if you're preaching a funeral on a cross-cultural context, just find out from people, hey, what are some things I shouldn't say? Because sometimes we have a clever anecdote we want to share at a funeral that, maybe for an American audience, a Western audience might bring comfort. Or maybe I've preached my grandma's funeral, my
Hmm.
uncle's funeral, and there were in both occasions when used appropriately, you can incorporate some humor
Hmm.
into into the message. Here, it just I don't see. I'm trying to think. I don't think there's any there's nowhere where it would be appropriate to
Mm,
incorporate any sort of humor in a funeral context, So, um,
yeah,
all that being said, there's a lot, yeah, definitely to take into consideration, and a lot you can learn
yeah.
about the culture and the way people view life when they are facing death.
One last thing that struck us because this was the first time we hadn't really thought about it until it actually happened. This was the first time that our kids had actually gone to a funeral
Okay.
and someone they knew really well. This lady was very integral in the kids' classes, and so it was real big impact for our kids. And so walking your kids through death, if your kids have grown on the mission field and they're not around it, it's interesting in America where I lived. You know, I was so infrequently confronted with death. I think partially because Americans live a lot
Right.
longer lives. The danger factor is just not as much. But here in the Dominican, we are confronted with death all the time.
Mm,
People die in motorcycle accidents. People die from diseases that weren't caught.
mm,
You name it. It is, you know, you're affected. And here, I guess maybe because if you know somebody and their aunt or their uncle or their cousin or their grandparents passed away, oftentimes you need to go pay respects. Maybe not all
right.
day like you were mentioning,
Right.
like a beloved member of the church, but constantly we are, having death cross our path, but it had never really happened for our kids because we don't make them obviously go to that. But it was very unique how the kids handled it. And then we had this one experience. You're talking about people watching. We're sitting outside this person's home. They had a very small home on a main thoroughfare, and these people just come in and come out. And you know what this is like to get the look when someone sees you for the first time and like, who's that person? Like, what's that guy doing here? But when they saw my four kids sitting there, this one lady, you think she had gone to the zoo. She is just looking at our kids like they were like the most unique animals you'd ever seen, and she didn't mean anything bad by it. But
Yeah.
I was so proud of my kids to just sit there in a very difficult time and kind of take that, and so there's this added
Yes.
interesting layer to when you are part of a funeral and everyone knows you are the outsider. So that's
Right.
why it's really important to always be very respectful and just to be mindful of what's going around. But understand this, and this is what I kind of want to end on. You can finish up too. Missionary, the opportunity you get is to preach the gospel. I mean, the
Yeah.
whole reason we're here, it is sad when someone we love passes away. Oftentimes we may not have that connection with that person who passed away. We've been asked to give a funeral, but really it is the most amazing opportunity to represent Christ and offer true hope to people who probably are looking for hope and answers like never before. And so don't take it lightly. It's nobody wants to do that. I guarantee you that, but you need to be prepared for it and understand that it is something that's going to come across your plate in one of your times as being a missionary.
You're absolutely right. And you mentioned, especially in certain countries where they're going to put the body in the ground within 24 hours,
Hmm.
you need to be ready to drop everything at the drop of a hat because this is an incredible opportunity. You might have people in attendance from all different backgrounds.
Yep.
We have animists, the funeral I preached of the gentleman who had just been saved. He had family that were just straight up animist, family that was Muslim, family that was Roman Catholic, and I was able to share a clear presentation of the gospel where everybody is listening. They're not there for a rebuttal, they're not there for a debate, they're not there for even a discussion. They're there to listen. What happened to this guy? Where is he now? You know what I mean? And so it is an incredible opportunity to be able to share truth with confidence and then make that truth available to those who are at a moment in their life where they're open, they're tender, the reality of death is right there in front of them, and it's a much more sober time in which you can share the gospel. So make the best of it if you're a missionary. Just seek the Lord's guidance. Ask the Holy Spirit to give you wisdom beyond your ability as you conduct and lead a funeral, and not just the message, but just the entire surrounding. The going to the home and dealing with the loved ones and all of that. because it is such a crucial time in building relationships in your community, building a strong sense of leadership even within your church and community, and just giving you an opportunity to share the gospel.
Well, this hasn't been an episode that was one that we were planning, but I think it's still a good one for future missionaries, current missionaries, maybe even just those who follow our ministries and want to know what it's like on the mission field when things like this happen. I do want to say that in the next week or so, I'd like to have a more fun, upbeat podcast with Josh. I want to talk about holidays on the mission field, Thanksgiving, Christmas, New Year's, and not only talk about what our mission field, our respective countries are like, but kind of how we as missionaries maybe wind down the year, looking forward to the next year. And I think people would find some great insight in that. So this is Eric Johnson from the Dominican Republic.
Josh Mead over here in Senegal, West Africa.
You guys have a great day.
God bless.